Hey YouTube, welcome back. In today's video, we're going to be talking about several theories regarding the evolution of the Israelite religion and looking at a couple of accusations where secular academics accuse the Bible of stealing from other cultures. So we're going to take a look at a couple of those and see if that's true or if it was the culture around Israel actually borrowing from the Bible. Before we get started, I want to take a moment to ask you to please hit the like button and subscribe to this channel. Up until the 19th century, most people believed the Bible and they took it at face value. Somewhere in the first half of the 1800s, Auguste Comte started the positivist approach with regards to the Hebrew religion. Positivism is a philosophy that says science needs positive facts from sensory experiences, and it needs to be interpreted through rational and or mathematical methods. You know, this is just a fancy way of saying that the Bible needs to be interpreted through naturalistic methods. Everything came about by chance over vast periods of time through natural processes. This started the trend of trying to explain the Bible events from a naturalistic perspective. The Bible, at this point, is no longer the authority, and now people are trying to interpret the Bible from what they can observe. We have to remember that there's a big difference between observational science and historical science. Observational science is stuff that we can observe. It's technology that we can build. It's things that we can see with our eyes and thus test and repeat. What you really think of as science. Like when you take a biology lab, you can see that you can actually see bacteria in a tray become resistant to antibiotics. So you can see that happening, but at the end of the day, that bacteria is still bacteria. Where it turns into historical science is when they try to make calculations about what it was before bacteria, even though no kind of creature has ever been observed turning into another kind of creature, which makes the theory of evolution not observational science. It's historical science. We cannot observe anything from the past with historical science except to make guesses or calculations. This stands opposite to observed science like physics and medicines. Everybody has a lens that they look at the data through. In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth, or in the beginning, nothing created something by naturalistic processes, and over vast ages, one kind of type of the first single-celled microcelled organism evolved into all the funny-looking creatures and people and trees and fruits and vegetables that we have today. If you ask me, that is quite a fairy tale. The positivist premise teaches that religion is merely a product of human culture, and that religion it started to evolve because people were trying to explain their surroundings to themselves. Well, this camp, the positivist camp, denies that the Torah was the starting point and teaches that the Old Testament evolved over time to meet priestly beliefs and practices. By looking at ancient society, some scholars have noticed similarities in the Hebrew religion and the surrounding cultures, such as the Babylonians. As we will see in this video, this is a direct attack on the events at Sinai and other accounts given to us in the Holy Scriptures. It's an attack on God's Word. Has God really said? Hugo Wickler built upon these ideas and formed what is now known as the Pan-Babylonian Theory. The Pan-Babylonian Theory assumes that all people of antiquity subscribed to the concepts and religious ideas of the Babylonians, including the Jews. Once that fire was lit, the flame quickly spread to the accusation that many of the Old Testament events were borrowed from Babylonian sources, and thus the Jews plagiarized, and that's what the Bible is. Well, they used secular archaeology based on naturalism to say that the religious artifacts that they found from Babylonia predated the patriarchal period. What is important to understand at this point is that archaeologists do not dig up the past archaeologists dig up the present. These artifacts don't come out with tags on them. They have to interpret the findings in order to estimate a date. Again, everybody starts with the bias. Creationists start with the bias or lens of, in the beginning God created the heavens and the earth and everything happened exactly as God described it. Whereas the evolutionists would say everything came about by chance. We don't know exactly how, but once the first single-celled organism came into being, slowly over vast periods of time, it evolved into everything else. Well, in the archaeological world, for the most part, they use naturalistic evolution of species and culture as a starting point to interpret the data through their preconceived lens. Who's your authority? God's word or man's word? This is a far cry from having the Bible as their authority. The accusation still stands, though, that Hebrews borrowed directly from the Babylonian myths. So I'd like to spend the rest of our time together in this video today addressing a couple of the more prominent accusations one by one. The first accusation that I would like to discuss is the accusation that says Moses plagiarized the law from the Code of Hammurabi. Hammurabi was a Babylonian king who ruled from the years 1795 BC all the way up until 1750 years before Christ. Hammurabi is responsible for putting together a system of laws. This predates, the Code of Hammurabi predates the Mosaic Law by about 300 years, and critics point to the similarities between the Code of Hammurabi and the Law of Moses. Well, if it is true that Moses plagiarized the law from the Code of Hammurabi, then that would indeed make the whole event at Mount Sinai false. There are many examples of similarities between the law of Moses and the Code of Hammurabi, such as an eye for an eye and giving the death penalty in cases of adultery and kidnapping. These similarities do not mean that Moses plagiarized, but rather it means that murder, theft, adultery, and kidnapping, etc., are problems that all societies have to deal with. You know, there are very similar laws all over the world today, but that does not mean that one country stole from another country to make their laws. Again, it just means that murder, theft, adultery, kidnapping are against the law everywhere because there are problems everywhere. The differences between the law of Moses and the Code of Hammurabi are also very significant but conveniently left out by secular scholars. The law of Moses focuses on God and getting along with God, whereas the Code of Hammurabi focused on civil matters only and was very harsh and brutal, and it focused on people getting along with people and being under the law to have a civilized government. The law of Moses goes so much farther than just a legal code because it speaks of sin being the actual problem. And again, having a relationship with God, how to fix your relationship with God once you've sinned. And we all sin. The law of Moses also speaks of forgiveness through sacrifices, which is where I talk about it makes a way to get right with God rather than just getting along with other people, which makes it significantly different. And in so many cases, the similarities between the law of Moses and the Code of Hammurabi are greatly exaggerated. I would encourage you to look up and read the Code of Hammurabi to see for yourself the big differences and exaggerated claims of similarities. Now, for our second example, let's look at some real borrowing that was done from one source to another. In this case, the Bible is not borrowing. Rather, the pagan myths are borrowing, even though supposed academics cry differently. And they're hoping you don't take the time to actually look deeper into it. A pagan legend says that Sargon was placed in a basket and put in a river by his mom. He was then found, rescued, and adopted by Aki. Wait a second, that sounds a lot like the event that happened to Moses. Uh-oh. Because the supposed problem comes in that Sargon lived 800 years before Moses. No, there's no uh-oh. You want to know why? I'll tell you why. The Bible did not borrow this story. the story was borrowed from the Bible, because what we do know about Sargon comes from records written some hundreds of years after his death. This legend of Sargon comes from 2 7th century BC cuneiform tablets. That is great news for the Bible, because that means that they were written hundreds of years after the book of Exodus. So even though Sargon supposedly lived before Exodus was written, the earliest writings of Exodus predate the earliest writings of Sargon, because the legend of Sargon comes from 2 7th century BC cuneiform tablets. What that means is, if there was any borrowing going on, it wasn't the Bible borrowing from the pagan myths, it was the pagan myths borrowing from the Bible. Lastly, for our third example, I would like to consider Noah's flood. It is true that biblical accounts have similarities with the Epic of Gilgamesh, which is Babylonian. You know, even more than that, there are hundreds of flood legends from cultures all over the world. This is easily explained because every culture descended directly from Noah and his 3 sons, Shem, Ham, and Japheth. This verifies and supports the biblical accounts, because accounts of this worldwide event were passed down from generation to generation all over the world as people groups spread out after the Tower of Babel. This flood was a big deal, and that is why many of the descriptions of the event have similarities. The Babylonian accounts, as well as accounts all over the world, are talking about the same exact event and was just passed down through their ancestors. Liberal scholars want to pretend that no flood actually really happened, and that the Bible borrowed from Babylonian mythology. The actual evidence, though, if we're going to be honest with ourselves, points us to the conclusion that the flood was real. In addition to the overwhelming geographical evidence of a worldwide flood, we also have these legends from all over the world speaking of Noah's flood day as a real event. And the geographical evidence for the flood, what do we find? Billions of dead things buried in rock layers, laid down by water all over the earth. Legends often have an element of truth to them. The biblical record, though, is the God-endorsed, trustworthy, actual account of the event, or what I like to call a true narrative. In conclusion, the weaknesses of these attacks on the Bible that we were briefly introduced to are many, and the accusations actually bring more problems than they address, and with reason and logic, they actually validate the Bible even further. You know, oftentimes people criticize the Bible because, especially the New Testament, they'll criticize it because they'll say, well, that was written years after the events. Okay, but then they'll take the legend of Sargon, which was written hundreds of years after his life, but then they'll use that as an authority. So as you can see, they don't actually follow their own rules. At the end of the day, this is simply an authority issue. Who is your authority? Is it God's word or is it man's word? Is observational science, which is always changing, our authority, or is God's word our authority? Secular academics are always willing to put us as Christians onto the merry-go-round, but the word of the Lord endures forever. Science is always changing, but God and his word will never change. Thank you for watching. Please hit the like button, subscribe to this channel, and I hope to see you in the next video.